Welcome back. At this point, let's turn our attention to the world of art. We've already seen AI generating a painting or creating a song. There's a question of how good they are. But now we're noticing more interesting relationships between art and AI. New questions arise around the nature of creativity and the audience's relationship with the piece, let alone all the crypto art purchases we are now seeing in the news. To start our discussion on AI's role in art, please welcome Ken Goldberg. Ken is a professor of industrial engineering and operations research at the University of California, Berkeley. He's an award-winning roboticist, filmmaker, and artist. And his art installations have been shown at the Whitney Biennial and the Berkeley Art Museum, among others. I actually met Ken in my first week of graduate school at Carnegie Mellon, as he was asked to hold his PhD defense during our orientation so that we new kids could see what finishing a great PhD was like. Even then, he was this cool guy combining robotics and art. And I still remember being amazed by this robot arm that he had programmed to make unique paintings. Ken continues to create groundbreaking combinations of art and robotics today. Ken, welcome, and please begin your presentation.
Thank you, James. It's a pleasure, and I remember that day very well. So I'm really delighted to be here and to speak to you and the HAI audience about art. And I'm going to try to take it in a slightly different direction. But before I go, I want to share a joke about artificial intelligence. I'm going to try this out on you guys. So the joke is that a startup has made a major breakthrough in artificial intelligence, and they decide that to announce it, they're going to do a test during the Super Bowl, and they have a worldwide competition to figure out what question should they ask it. So after months of suggestions and voting and everything else, everyone agrees the question is going to be, is there a God? So at the next Super Bowl, everybody's watching, and they type in the question, and the AI system puts out a progress bar, bink, 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 insufficient computing. So everybody, so there's a big disappointment, but the CEO goes around and talks to all the other tech companies, the big players, Google, Amazon, Facebook, even Apple agrees. They get Baidu and Alibaba. Everyone basically agrees to share their data with the company. In fact, share their computing, and also all the computing of all the laptops and desktops and phones. So next year they go back halftime, type in the question, bink, 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 insufficient data. So now the CEO, she's undaunted. She goes to the United Nations. And she says, we need everyone to get on board. So she convinces China and the US and the Russians. Vladimir Putin is on board. Everybody's on board. They agree to share all of their data without restrictions, all the government data, all the personal data, all the private financial data, everything with the system. So it will have the best opportunity, all the networking and the computing in the world. And so they go back to the Super Bowl and they type in the question, bink, 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 thank you. Wait, what did it mean? Thank you. Well, that's not the answer. Type it in again. They must have misunderstood. They type in the question, is there a God? It says, now there is. Okay, that's my joke. Let's move on. I want to thank everybody who I've had the pleasure to work with over the years, and acknowledge the hugely changed world we've been living in the past year. And we've talked about this in the last session about healthcare. It is really affecting everything. It's also creating a real re-examination of many social issues. And there's been a lot of, I think, valuable reassessment and rethinking about Black Lives Matter and also most recently about anti-Asian violence at least in this country. And I'm going to come back to that. I want to say that there is a huge division, and we have to acknowledge, not only in the US, but worldwide, between different groups, and it's persisting. And I think this is very interesting in the context of what we're here to talk about today, and in terms of AI. That I want to go back in history, though, to put some of this in context and talk about how artists and thinkers have wrestled with AI over the centuries. And let's go back all the way to Ovid's Metamorphosis and the story of Pygmalion, which was a sculptor who builds a statue, creates a statue that he then falls in love with. And the statue, it comes to life in his mind. It's a fascinating story. It's really the template, the archetype for a series of stories after that. Goes up through the Golem of Prague, again, creating a creature that in some way runs amok and leads to the downfall of the creator. Now, we also see this fascination with automatons that goes up through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. Da Vinci has built and builds a number of mechanical creatures, a mechanical horse. Descartes writes very persuasively about automata. And Volkansan makes the mechanical duck, the mechanical boys. And then we get to von Kempelen, who is a great trickster. He builds the mechanical Turk. And everyone knows the story. It's fascinating. There's a machine, it's brought out, and everybody inspects it, and then it proceeds to play astoundingly well at the game of chess. And it's not until years later that it's discovered the secret was that there were a small person, a very petite person hiding inside the machinery who was driving the chessboard. And that person was a trained chess player. And in fact, there's a wonderful history about this, that the chess community knew about this because they used the world expert chess players who had a whole network of going and coming in the back doors to make this thing work. Now, this is right around the same time as E.T.A. Hoffman writes the wonderful story, The Sandman. And it also features an android, an automaton at its center. And in this case, it's a female automaton who's quite beautiful. And a boy falls in love with the creature. And the evil doctor there's a very deep psychological interaction between him and this doctor who is trying to lure the boy. And you have to read it for yourself. It's very complex. But that's in let's see, 1818, Shelley's Frankenstein, of course, comes out. And this is related to galvanism and the interest of electricity at the time. And we all know that story very well. But interestingly, then in a century later, we have the flu pandemic of 1918, 1919. And the reason I call this out is because it's right at the tail end of that pandemic that a very significant event occurs. One is that a book on exoticism comes out, Victor Segalin, 1918, which is later developed and expanded very eloquently by Edward Said in 1978 in Orientalism. But the other big event that happens at the tail end of the 1918 pandemic is Freud publishes his book, the Das Unheimlich, the Uncanny. And this is very important. It's a very dense essay. It's known as Freud's only aesthetic study of aesthetics and art. And he really studies this in the context of Hoffman's book and also Gothic literature, but more importantly, psychology more generally. He talks about this emotion for which we don't have a word in English. Uncanny really doesn't actually capture it. It's something that makes your hair stand on end when something is that you're familiar with suddenly feels strange. And that dynamic in which he elaborates in many different ways. You have that sensation of being watched. There's many other forms in which it takes, but Freud is the first to write about this as a concept, and it becomes increasingly interesting for artists and writers over the following century. Now, also note this timing, because that's 1919, right after the pandemic. A year later, Karl Čapek coins the term robot in a play in Czechoslovakia that he launches called Rossum's Universal Robots. So this is interesting just to think about this climate, and you have the Uncanny coming out and you have robot right at the tail end of that last pandemic. Then this continues. There's a lot of interest in the idea of robot. and Uncanny, and Fritz Lang's Metropolis comes out in 1927. Asimov's Three Laws are published in the iRobot series in the 50s. Nam June Paik is the well-known Korean artist who comes to the US and builds a series of robotic sculptures. And then in 1970, Masahiro Mori does something very interesting. He's a designer, a roboticist based in Tokyo, and he is working on prosthetic hands. And he makes the observation that if the hands are too realistic, they will actually cause people to be alienated. People will be turned off by these hands. So you have to make them not too realistic. And he basically comes up with a theory about this that he calls the uncanny valley. And it looks like this. If you imagine the horizontal axis of just a general plot, it's not really meant to be quantitative, but a plot of something being not human on one end and very human on the other. And then he plots that, he says that the likability or the agreeableness of the robot is on the vertical axis. And so he basically plots this chart. So as the robot becomes more human-like, it becomes more likable. But then it gets to a critical point in which there's a sudden drop, the valley. And that if you continue to make the robot more human-like, it suddenly becomes intensely uncomfortable and unlikable. And that's the uncanny valley that Mori talks about. Again, if you continue to make it more human, you come back up and you get into real humans, and those are quite likable. So this is what he's talking about. This and Ishiguro is a roboticist, and I consider him an artist, also in Japan, and he's building these humanoids, and they're very much in the spirit of tweaking our perception about our comfort level between something that's intensely lifelike. And I don't know about you, but I find these a little disturbing. So I want to say that there's this idea of the uncanny. I can really talk for quite a long time about it, but and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk more in the panel, because I think it's a very interesting theme to think about in the context of AI and art. And I also want to make a distinction between the representational uncanny, that is where you're looking at someone that might something that looks human but isn't, and what I call the experiential uncanny. And that is where there's experiences that may also feel lifelike but are not. And I think that is a generalization of the idea of the uncanny. And I'll give you two examples from my own work, and to close with. And one is what I call what we developed back 25 years ago now. It was we called it the Telegarden, and this is the early days of the internet. The internet had come out in 1993, 94, and my students and I were extremely excited about it. We wanted to get involved and contribute, and we had a robot in our lab. And so we thought, well, what about connecting the robot to the internet? And that way anyone in the world could have access to it. So we negotiated to get an industrial robot arm, and we set it up. And what would it do? Well, we decided that it would tend a garden. And this is really where the artistic side of it came in, because to my mind, the garden was the last thing people would want to do over the internet. I thought, if all the things that the benefits of a garden is to go out and, get your hands dirty, and to be with nature. But I wanted to see, it was an experiment. So we built this thing, we put it online, and we didn't know if anybody was going to operate it or not, but it was surprising to us. The system was set up, so again, with a very simple interface using Mosaic. Some of you may remember that ancient browser, and it allowed you to visit the garden, move the camera around. The camera's at the end effector, and then you could also water the garden. And if you registered, you were then given a seed, and you could choose anywhere in the garden to plant it. Well, so as I mentioned, we didn't know whether it's going to be, what the response might be. And at first we got, a few dozen, then quickly hundreds, and then thousands. And if any of you are gardeners, you know that it's in about a 3-meter circular space, you can't really sustain more than a few hundred. So it quickly became vastly overgrown and became much more of a study in the tragedy of the commons. than we anticipated. Anyway, we kept this thing going for a while. We ended up writing a book that's still available, and it's involved. We invited 6 engineers, 6 artists, and 6 philosophers to write chapters for the book about the issues of the garden itself and what we called telepistemology. Now, this is a term that never caught on, but the idea was, what is the status of knowledge at a distance? That was an issue that arose for us. And in other words, how would you know that there is a real garden? And here, let me explain that a little more. Is that it is possible that we could have created this as a virtual reality system, which in other words, a fictional system made with computer graphics, instead of a real system, which we would call distal reality, where there's a real garden, but you're distant from it and you're mediated through the internet. And this distinction is subtle. And in other words, how do you know? How can you make that distinction between something that's fictional but realistic and something that's real but distant? And that was the central question of telepistemology. And I believe that since we put out the Telegarden 25 years ago, the question has become even more interesting. In some sense, virtual reality has become much more sophisticated. As we know, computer graphics is almost indistinguishable from reality, and there's deep fakes and many other troubling versions of that. And then reality has also been called into question. I mean, need I say more? I mean, I think we're in an era of questioning what is real, what is truth. And so in these contexts, this dynamic becomes even more complicated. So now this comes to our new project, and I've always wanted to revisit the Telegarden, but I didn't want to create the same thing again. So in the last few years, I've been very interested in artificial intelligence, and as a roboticist, I've been very, very closely following the advances in deep learning. And this really is a major breakthrough. It was largely, initiated by Fei-Fei Li and the work on ImageNet, which led to the major breakthroughs from Jeff Hinton and others in demonstrating the power of deep learning and its widespread adoption today. And we use it in my lab. My students and I use it regularly. We work with colleagues at Berkeley, Berkeley AI Research Lab. I'll put in that plug since we're here at Stanford today. But the idea of deep learning is very profound and provocative. And there's been a lot of excitement around it. I think the same kind of uncanniness has returned in the context of talk about superintelligence and the singularity. I mean, the idea that we are now on the verge of surpassing human capabilities. And I wanted to, again, push back on that and question it and ask, in this case, could a robot, an AI system, use deep learning to acquire the ability to tend a garden? And so, in other words, the Telegarden was really exploring telepresence and human interaction, social interactions over the internet. But this is what we call the Alpha Garden is about artificial intelligence and our relationship to nature. And so the system that we're building, and it's an ongoing project, has a mechanical robot. And here's the shot of one version of it in a greenhouse at Berkeley. And so it's capable with this gantry of moving around in the garden space. And then there's overhead cameras that observe the garden and then determine when to water and prune. But it's a polyculture garden. So it has not only one type of plant, but multiple plants working in close proximity. So it's very difficult. And I would have to say, I'm sort of betting that it may not be possible. The robot has struggled with this challenge. And I'll just tell you one last story, which is that when we put the system up, it was we were surprised by the emergence of COVID-19 last spring, and we were forced to abandon the greenhouse. We weren't allowed to go back in, and then we watched helplessly from a distance over the cameras as the garden essentially went into its death throes, and it died. And I feel as though we watched this, and it was almost, to my mind, it reminded me of Guernica. This incredible struggle of the garden to send out flowers and send out essentially a plea for help in its last phases. All right, so the last thing I'll say is that all of this reminds me to some degree, the turmoil and the stress today reminds me of the fears about immigrants over the years. There's been, 100 years ago, there was again a fear of this idea of the yellow peril immigrants being from China. And Oliver Morton has this wonderful quote that robots are immigrants, not from a distant land, but from the future. So I leave you with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken, for that fascinating presentation, looking at your work with experiences, the uncanny valley, and now Ken and AI tend to garden. I really like it. At this point, I'd like to invite our students to begin their lightning presentations.
Hi, I'm Jack Atherton. This is Reality by Example, a tool for supporting amateur creativity through the use of interactive machine learning. So, Reality by Example is a tool and meta environment in virtual reality where people can construct a world by placing small examples of how they would like the world to look and act. Here the user is changing an example that the type of land here should be more bouldery. Then they place a new example that the color of the land over here should be more green. The tool interpolates between all their examples to show them something that it thinks approximates what they want, and they iterate by placing more examples. You can also leave temporal examples, like teaching a bird to fly by flapping your arms. After I've recorded one example for this bird, then it starts to move through the world using that data as a way of understanding how it should act.
For many of us, our voice is our most expressive communication tool. Our voice encodes who we are, where we are, and how we're doing. These contextual factors, some momentary and some long-held, influence the way we sound. My PhD work aims to define how this context space manifests within the voice. I incorporate psychoacoustics, sociomusicology, linguistics, and signal processing into my research. My research includes identifying pronunciation bias, learning context without labeled data, reconstructing how the voice radiates into acoustic spaces, and parameterizing the space between speech and musical sound. In concert, these projects aim to model a contextual paradigm that spans the diversity of vocalizations. Through designing AI to leverage how an artist or a communicator embeds their context into their personal sound, we can create voice-based technologies that lean into a user's individuality.
Hello, my name is Miguel Novello. I'm a new media artist, a filmmaker, and I'm an MFA student at Stanford. My recent work has investigated an evolution and decay in language, simulations of identity, and media translations. Understanding our mediated selves is how I think I can achieve an open and free communication needed for my work. Bodiless Migration 20 in Hyperspace Time is a video piece composed of 3 panels and meant to be experienced on the internet. It's a direct response to my engagement in our current reality, and for that I made an avatar that allows me to engage in a modular free-form world. In this piece, I'm using computer animation software, machine learning animations, undersea footage, zoom screen capture, drawings, and chroma key compositions. The use of AI comes within the creation of an image of my body without its physical properties. For that, I combine a series of data sets, such as my body motion, my weight, scale, and memories of my interaction with technology, such as images of my internet consumption, my data usage, my browsing history, and the time I spent on screens. I compose a new blue world full of simulation in order to come back, perhaps with a newer physical and conceptual body, to envision myself in new forms of empathies, to reimagine borderless stories, and ultimately feel as free as I feel in the digital space, but in the physical world. Thank you so much for your time.
Hi, I'm Panos, and this is the presentation for Artemis, Affective Language for Art. In Artemis, we introduce a dataset that contains affective responses of thousands of humans with respect to how they feel when they observe a famous work of art, and crucially, a written explanation regarding why. The collected explanations are very rich in abstract, metaphorical, and imaginative content. Furthermore, with Artemis, we embrace open-ended explanations and the subjectivity that comes along with different individuals. Tapping on our rich dataset, we design neural speakers that, similar to humans, can create explanations to support different emotions, such as these examples on unseen paintings that explain positive and negative emotions. Interestingly, our neural speakers can guess the likely emotion for a painting or be asked to express different emotions for the same painting. For more details, including the data and code, please visit our webpage.
You really saw some excellent ideas there in those talks by our students. Next, we have HAI visiting artist Rashaad Newsome. Rashaad's work blends collage, sculpture, film, photography, music, computer programming, software engineering, community organizing, and performance. His work celebrates Black contributions to the art canon and creates inclusive forms of culture and media. Rashaad, please take it away.
Hello, thanks for having me. I feel that the core narrative of the human condition, birth, growth, emotion, aspiration, conflict, and mortality are all susceptible to corruption within Bell Hooks' theory of the capitalist, imperialist, white supremacist patriarchy. I believe we must examine how these operating systems of domination function intangibly to define our reality before we can get to the business of making a human-centered AI. The results of this interrogation should then act as the moral compass for this work. We can attempt to understand the meaning of being human from situations that seek to keep certain beings outside of the accepted realm of humanity. Since it has been said frequently enough that slavery denies humanity to slaves, it is crucial to find out what it is that is being denied and how the conceptual interpretation of the slave works. As scholar Ruha Benjamin argues in Race After Technology, discussions of robots have been historically a way of talking about dehumanization and not about racialization, even though the that word always fucks me up, etymological root of the word robot is check, coming from the compulsory service. Historically, Black people have performed that unpaid forced labor. When we came to America, we were not acknowledged as human beings, but things or tools, neither occupying the classic subject nor object position. We function as particular types of objects seen as limited in thought and feeling. Historically, there was often doubt about Black interiority, a convenient ideology making the mechanization of slave labor natural, even inevitable. As a result, we occupied a peculiar non-binary space of being, which has disturbing analogies to the queer space inhabited by robots. Slaves and robots have in common that they are meant to be excluded from the concept and the company of humans and are intended to obey orders. Robots from films and television shows like Blade Runner, The Terminator, Ex Machina, Prometheus, and Westworld provide a way to think about the interactions between technology, intersectionality, and dehumanization. Could this be a starting point to call upon the imagination as a way to reconstruct and re-envision the idea of being? Can we garner strength and inspiration from these concepts? Using a combination of animation, game engines, scripted responses, generative grammars, and basic machine learning models, I produced a unique and provocative chatbot called Being in 2019. This version of Being can be seen as Being 1.0 and is an expansion of the research that informed my previous assemblage and sculpture work that explores the art historical erasure of African Americans, as well as what we understand as abstraction and technology in the West today. Being 1.0 was a sort of interactive installation where when viewers entered the exhibition, they would walk up to the microphone in front of a screen and say hello, which would then trigger the script. Being would then act as a tour guide of the exhibition, but periodically Being would break protocol and say things like, look, boo-boo, I just can't. or look, I don't have time for this. I need to express myself. And I was doing that with this bot as a way to sort of think about conversations that were happening in my other work around the importance and complexities of agency. And within this particular project, thinking about agency around robots, our agents. And so what would it look like to write a script for agency for a robot? And for me, what that looked like was them breaking protocol. Also giving them the ability to be creative and express themselves. Often in sci-fi films, there is this narrative trope where if a robot is able to create, they will create more of themselves and kill human beings, which I personally believe is rooted in a deep narcissism that stems from white supremacist ideals. So within the exhibition, being is not only allowed to express themselves, but also to take part in the role of a tour guide when they want and leave that when they want. During my 2020/2021 artist residency at HAI, I've been focusing on the concept, scholarship, and creation of a counter-hegemonic algorithm. Since October 2020, I have been compiling a large data corpus of related texts such as Bell Hooks, Paulo Freire, Frantz Fanon, James Baldwin, Michel Foucault, Judith Butler, and a slew of others. This material is used to create a unique search algorithm that uses non-Western index methods and highlights alternative histories and archives, such as abolitionist texts, queer texts, and the like. Using this algorithm, I want to sort of highlight what I feel artificial intelligence is not doing at the moment. Also, I'm looking at this model as a griot, and in West African tradition, a griot is a healer, a performance artist, an archive. And I've been thinking a lot about the whole idea of an archive. And, because of relentless marginalization of the Black queer community, so many people in that community have died, particularly when you think about the history of the ballroom community, which is a community I've been a part of for a long time. And so I've been working with leaders in that community and using mocap to motion track the movement data of practitioners of Vogue Femme from old way, new way to Vogue Femme and all its subsets, and sort of having beings, avatars sort of act as an archive for that dance. And then I will write a script using the counter-hegemonic algorithm for being to propose what I'm calling decolonization workshops. And these workshops will be comprised of, at one moment we're dancing, at another moment we're sitting down, engaging in group EMDR therapy, and also critical pedagogy. And for me, this is sort of a reimagining of non-Eurocentric archive and education models. In addition to that model, I created an offshoot that I guess can be seen as being 1.5. This particular model is really going to be more of an app that exists on the phone, and as well as a mobile, a computer-based app. And this app is created specifically for African Americans. And it really was inspired by the recent rash of killings last year. I was feeling a lot of anxiety, depression, and rage, quite frankly, around what was going on, as was so many people in my community. And I wanted to do something, but at the moment we were all in lockdown. And so I thought, I had this machine learning model. How could I use this model to be of service? And so since then, I've been developing another version of this bot that will sort of act as a virtual therapist, sort of building on some of the ideas around the early virtual therapist, Eliza. And so Being will offer to their users EMDR therapy. They will act as a mindful meditation leader. They will also, using social media, connect their different users so that they can also engage in healing work outside of the work that they do with them. They will also give the users daily affirmations, and as a way to make sure that this tool gets to the communities that need it, I'm working with Hyundai to create a sort of being mobile where we're going to quite literally pull up to hoods across the nation and make people aware of this technology, as well as do a sort of a wheat paste campaign in all of the cities that we're going to hit, and do a series of New Orleans style parades that galvanize the community and make them aware of this technology.
Thank you, Rashaad, for sharing these thought-provoking works, and especially ideas on what AI is not doing right now. Our final speakers in our art session are focused on the relationship between music and AI. Hilary Hahn is a 3-time Grammy Award-winning violinist and co-founder of DeepMusic.ai. Carol Reiley is her co-founder and the CEO of DeepMusic. Carol, Hilary, welcome, and please begin your talk.
But this is actually our first speaking engagement together, so we're excited and honored to introduce the work that we've been facilitating. We co-founded this organization together because while we were talking, we realized that there was a need for a designated community to connect the AI and arts fields in a space where we could share ideas and without judgment, we could have feedback for whatever we exchanged and the projects that could be created. So today we'll be presenting the who, what, why, and how behind DeepMusic.ai, and sharing the first phase of our project, which was to commission and premiere AI-assisted pieces from 3 prestigious, highly original composers using world-class AI tools. We'll then share what caught our attention during this process and conclude with a video of Hilary's world premiere of one of these works. So first, we're going to just introduce ourselves more in detail.
Hi, I'm Hilary Hahn. I'm representing the East Coast today. I'm over in Boston. As a violin soloist, I've been performing professionally for nearly 30 years, and I tour 5 continents on a regular basis. I've made 20 feature albums and received 3 Grammys. My latest record, Paris, is currently at #1 on the classical Billboard chart, and I've premiered about 50 works of new music that were written for me. I'm super inspired by artists' creative processes, and I love connecting people through the shared humanity of the arts. Carol and I met in Baltimore through friends more than a decade ago while Carol was in grad school at Johns Hopkins. I've always appreciated her empathic perspective, her broad knowledge base, and her curiosity. In fact, DeepMusic.ai grew out of an engrossing 3-hour conversation about the benefits and challenges of linking artists with AI. We've since delved much deeper into the connections between the fields. It's galvanizing to merge seemingly disparate landscapes. Through DeepMusic.ai, we hope to encourage greater cross-pollination between AI and creativity, bringing more people together to influence the future of these fields.
Yep, and hi, I'm Carol Reiley. I'm an AI entrepreneur and roboticist based in Silicon Valley, right down the street. And it's been amazing to have the opportunity to work with Hilary, someone whose work I've long respected, not just for her technical proficiency performing, but also who brings so much thoughtful reflection to her craft and who really knows herself as an artist. It's been really fun just to work with one of your friends and have the chance to connect creatively. A little bit about myself. I, like Ken, am also at the intersection of humans and machines, researching how tech can enhance our lives. I built air, sea, and space robots. I was previously working on surgical systems at Intuitive Surgical, space satellites at Lockheed Martin, and I founded a self-driving car startup that actually spun out of the Stanford AI lab here. We were acquired by Apple in 2019. I view AI really as a tool that can augment us to become superhuman. So whether it's going places we typically can't, like outer space or in the depths of the oceans, or scaling down motions with superhuman precision, or scaling up boulders to pick up boulders, I think our mission is really to be human-centric. So, the mission of DeepMusic.ai is to connect top professional artists and scientists to help shape the AI tools of tomorrow. And over the past few years, I've been interested in AI's impact on creativity and art. Music is one of the earliest applications of AI. They both have deep roots in math and have been so intertwined since the beginning. So we wanted to start there. And I see AI as a bridge between the arts and the science fields. What Hilary and I are trying to do is figure out ways to unleash a way for creatives to become super creative and augment that. It's still the early days, but we've been introducing new technologies to artists to see what they would like to create.
We kicked things off by commissioning 3 world-renowned human composers to create individual pieces with their choice of AI music generation software. We premiered the 3 resulting works at our launch in December, followed by a deep diving panel conversation with the composers. I premiered a solo violin piece by my colleague David Lang, a Pulitzer Prize-winning composer, pillar of the contemporary music community, and current artist in residence at Princeton. We worked with Michael Abels on a solo piano work. Michael wrote the soundtrack to Jordan Peele's Get Out and Us, among other popular soundtracks and concert pieces. The phenomenal pianist Dominic Cayley premiered Michael's composition for us. And we commissioned Dana Leong, a genre-bending, double Grammy-winning, multi-instrumental composer-performer, WEF, YGL, a multi-hyphenate if I've ever met one. He decided on a big-scale orchestral piece. For his premiere, he performed most of the instruments himself due to social gathering restrictions. These composers are all groundbreaking leaders in their areas of expertise. We were fortunate to work with them on this project. Because of lockdown, their schedules had changed and they had pockets of availability. Otherwise, we probably would have had to wait 3 years for their input.
It's great. The software platforms that they had chosen to generate and influence their pieces were OpenAI's MuseNet and Ava, and we were fortunate enough to be able to work with some of the scientists at those teams. So, the next question of why is this important at this moment in time? AI has been moving at unprecedented speeds, disrupting industry after industry, as shown here today at this conference. It's one of the most powerful tools that we're going to encounter. And creativity is often thought to be uniquely human because it's what we say that we excel at as a species and where AI is said to fall short. But we're really starting to see that challenged with things like GANs-generated artwork, headlines written by bots, and then this music generated by AI systems. And this AI creativity revolution that's happening also seems to be missing the voice of the current generation of artists themselves. So we wanted to really find a way to empower today's artists, to give them a seat at the table now, as these early tools are going to be developed, and help shape them before it becomes too late.
Artists now have a rare window to join the conversation with developers. The possibility of directly shaping the futures of our field, exchanging thoughts and knowledge with diverse voices. I find that potential very motivating and very urgent.
So we've mentioned the who, what, and why. Now for the how. Hilary, as Hilary mentioned, for this first phase, we commissioned the 3 pieces from the composers. And it was important to us to show a diversity, a variety of music across genres, instruments, and to give each human composer a chance to reflect their own voice in the AI program that they chose. So we wanted to test each element's collaborative limits. We wanted to make the process as transparent as possible. So you'll see in the videos and in the sheet music, it's all clearly delineated which notes were composed by the human and which ones were by the AI program, and if the notes were altered in any way. This is one example of the start of the sheet music where you'll see the AI raw output as one of the lines there. On our website, we also had the composers share artistic statements about their processing experience, which you can read at your own leisure. And then we hosted a live composers panel and have started one-on-one in-depth interviews with each composer.
There were some surprises in the process. For me, my experience premiering David Lang's piece in our launch wasn't that different from my prior premieres. I learned the music and played it. It wasn't so straightforward for the composers, though. They were essentially learning a new instrument of creativity, one without an established linear tradition. I was surprised at how much work was required by human composers in order to collaborate with the raw AI output. And I was very impressed by how they worked the challenges into the concepts of the pieces, inventing new solutions to bring their ideas to life. The composers' experiences sometimes read like a nerdy telenovela, but I was glad to see that the successes and challenges could be clearly identified, not because we're looking to foster criticism, but because frank feedback is essential to progress. Art is always progressing, so is AI rapidly. Art is the ultimate expression of humanity, so it tests AI in the best ways.
Yeah, definitely true. What I also saw and found most interesting was really the design choices on both the composers and the AI teams. For instance, the composers had such different approaches in how they wanted to use AI clips, and most had gone in with an idea of what they wanted to do. And also I was surprised by the clips that they actually selected. The composers found some of the clips that I would consider as failure cases the most interesting. And on the AI side, there were many times that the AI software output was just simply unplayable by a single human or a single instrument. And there was actually none of the software had parameters to be able to limit that. And it turned out to be a conscious decision from the scientists who wrote the software to not consider human limitations or define the number of people required to play the piece, because they actually didn't intend their software to be performed by humans. So they really optimized for listenability, and clips would frequently fall back on popular motifs or certain keys. So that was just interesting to see those design choices on both sides. And beyond performance and composition, I think Hilary and I realized just the depth of open questions still left to be decided regarding AI's impact on many different fields beyond just the work itself. It became about the authorship and legal rights, ethics, business models all changing. And these philosophical issues are something that we're going to be delving more into and talking about the importance of. So just to highlight what is coming up next for DeepMusic.ai, we've got 4 different things. The first is just to close the loop and offer the professional artist feedback back to the AI companies. We want to make sure we incorporate and affect both fields and change how the tools are being built. We're actively building an artist community to be ready to connect them with the AI teams who want to collaborate and hear from the artists directly. Hilary and I had started an open source database, kind of just tracking and documenting all the teams that exist that are making AI generated software in a variety of different creative fields, even past music generation. And it's open source, so we wanted to make sure that people understood what differentiates between the different AI software to figure out which one best suits their needs, and they could contribute to it. There's currently about 20 companies that make music generation today, 3 which have been acquired in the last 2 years, and there's about 10 research groups out there. And lastly, just a quick plug, DeepMusic.ai is sponsoring and helping organize the 2nd annual AI song competition, along with members from Google, Magenta, and ByteDance, which is the parent company of TikTok. So this is open to anyone who wants to create a pop song using AI. And deadline to register your team is next week, and the winners will be announced in June. You'll have time in between to make the piece. Okay, so
I love a big idea. And we have a lot of big ideas. Maybe it's an arts thing, but I like to think that imagining an ideal future can get us close to it. There's room for AI music to coexist with human composers and performers, whether as a selection of tools or as its own genre. And this isn't only about music, but music is an illuminating framework for us at DeepMusic.ai as we begin our explorations. As all of us participate in the development of our future lived experiences, we can aim to positively and gracefully merge technology with humanity.
Great, thanks, Hilary. And just to conclude, we wanted to share Hilary's premiere performance of David Lane's Out of Body. Hilary and I were actually both involved in the artistic process behind the piece, which we can talk about during the panel. David's style is really clearly identifiable through the choices that he made in the collaboration, particularly in how he selected and guided the AI output. And the result is a composition worthy of any concert stage. So it's really a pleasure presenting to you today. Here's Out of Body by David Lane, performed by Hilary Hahn at the launch of DeepMusic.ai. Enjoy. Just you'll note that the AI is was human written and AI written is clearly delineated by the colors there.
Thank you for that performance, Hilary, and thank you both for that wonderful talk. Now I'd like to welcome back all our panelists for a more in-depth conversation. So if you can all turn your videos back on. Russ, why don't you lead us off with a question from the audience?
Yeah, so actually this is my question. I guess it's the prerogative of a co-host. I'm asking for all of the artists really, what is the duty to inform an audience that the creator was AI or AI augmented? And what is the tradition in terms of provenance? I could imagine an argument where, of course, I want to know who wrote this versus, that's not so important. Why don't you develop your response and then we'll talk about it later. So I'd love all of your thoughts on this issue of the duty to inform about the provenance of a piece of art. Michelle, I'll ask you to start because you're my friend.
Well, no, that's a really big issue, actually. The last time I presented on Arts and AI, that was the first question that people asked is not about the duty to inform, but the anxiety about it, that you could be duped, that you could be betrayed by not. And then that was indexed to how are you going to evaluate something? So it was actually more of an emotional as well as an economic response as well. And I'm not even sure where the duty lies, especially because once something's out there in the wild, it's actually hard. It's untethered and sometimes from the artist itself, themselves. So I think that's a really challenging question. I'm not an artist myself, so I'm really curious about the amazing artists that are gathered here, how they understand this question. I think Carol raised one of the important things also about future of work too, which is behind the question is how are you going to recompense artists? If it's a hybrid, augmented piece, if it's if that work gets distributed without their permission or it's reproduced. So I think those are other kinds of questions about how do you not just value the art, but also value the artist in this new work environment too.
Carol and Hilary, how important was it that you tell people that set of compositions was AI augmented, or was that featured prominently in the public relations material, or could it have been dropped?
It cannot be dropped.
Yeah, I think that was one of the most important things for us, was because so much, like credit kind of get like so much hype is built around AI. We really wanted to evaluate where's the state of the art in AI today. What can it do? What are the limitations? And we wanted to work with professional artists who could very clearly see that and also knew their artistic process and how AI might impact them and where it might supplement them. So it was very important to us for the audience to understand what was AI written, what was not, what was altered, why was it altered. So all of that we wanted to make as clear as possible. Michelle, in regards to your question about, how do you value artists? I think right now it's completely open. And different AI software have different approaches. So we were careful to take a look at different licensing, at how each company valued artists, because it does vary across the board. Some, if you uploaded sheet music, they now owned it. Others are open source. So the two companies we worked with, the artists, it was important for us to have the composers own the copyright, and that artists like Hilary could play the piece, and it was, it was her piece to perform, and it was under a contract that they currently were used to. That was how we started. But we started to see, as we were talking with lawyers, just the different possibilities and concerns that artists have. And I will have Hilary expand on anything else.
Yeah, I mean, as a performer, I've also done some composition and recording, so I'm familiar with the world of IP, and it's really important to be transparent. The composers were also concerned about how their artistic expression would be perceived if it was altered by AI. And also they wanted to be responsible towards their colleagues and set good precedents and have the right kinds of conversations. And they were very, very thoughtful about it. And of course, we deferred to their needs and their comfort level. And if you see in the video, there's like human and AI. David really clearly, composer really clearly delineated his process, separating his notes from the AI generated notes and alternating them, but with intent. And so part of the piece, as it refers to how he creates, is actually in the intent of how he interacted. And if you don't know any of that, if it's not available and you don't know about him or what the piece is about, you lose a lot of the artistic statement, and the piece would not exist if it were not for David. And so just as we credit David, we also credit the AI, we credit the software and the platforms used. But one other interesting thing we found is that the word collaboration was problematic for composers, because it wasn't an equal collaboration. It was working with, and also the AI offered something really valuable, but it couldn't speak up for its needs. And so it's kind of interesting to navigate the wording around this kind of project.
I have one from the audience. Ken, your experiment with telerobotic gardening, the telegarden, was really fascinating. In your opinion, was this more an experiment in telerobotics or more of an experiment in art? Or maybe it's both. What did the philosophers who worked with you on the resulting book have to say about the matter? And what is more generally the role of philosophy in art and AI? And then I would add, similarly, can you say something about the Alpha Garden? Did the AI for the Alpha Garden have a goal? Was it beauty? Was it total growth? What did you tell it to do before it did its death spiral there during COVID?
Great. Okay, thank you. First, I would like to acknowledge the really excellent commentaries here today. I have to say, I've been doing a lot of thinking about Michelle's comment about the AI challenging the fetishizing of the individual genius. This idea is actually, I think, it's very, very interesting, and it's certainly, I hope we'll get a chance to talk a little bit about NFTs in this context. I was also really quite struck by Rashid's points about the origins of the word robot, and he's quite correct. And I think that this idea about reconstructing being from the element of robotics and rethinking what that means in the context of this, as you put it, so eloquently, the supremacist white capitalist ideology. And so there's so much to unpack here. I wish we had 3 or 4 days to go into this. And so to the question that you just asked about, the audience member just asked about the garden, it was both. I mean, it was I would say an engineering proof of concept to build an interface, but in many ways, really more of an artwork. I mean, really being open-ended
in the sense that the panelists are talking about. In other words, that I wasn't sure where it was going, and I think the best works often are that way. You start out with one intention, and somehow the work leads you to another one. In that case, it became more philosophical about what is the nature of reality. And Hubert Dreyfus, for example, was very reflective on this point. He was the one who pushed it to think of it in terms of epistemology and what direction that we would, how we could think about this more broadly than just the garden, but actually about the internet itself, that it was raising these deeper questions as we lived more of our experience online, that it would make us more uncertain about the status of reality. And that somewhat has come true. To your last question, James, about the Alpha Garden, it is definitely an artwork in the sense that, again, I'm not sure where it's going. And to your point about the reward function, we do actually have a numerical reward function. We want to optimize a measure of diversity that's related to entropy in the garden. So because it's polyculture, it's all about these plants in close proximity, which is very complex and not well modeled by existing agricultural models. So that's why to us, it's an interesting scientific question as well.
Rashaad, you mentioned feelings about anxiety, depression, rage in response to the injustices affecting your community. And if I understand it, being 1.5 was partially motivated to create a response to that. Did you get any feedback about how it worked? What were the reactions that you elicited with it?
Yeah, and so I have not launched it yet. Right now, I'm working on it as part of my residency. And so I'm really focused on consulting with therapists who specifically focus on EMDR therapy, and sort of figuring out how we can write a script for being to perform that task, but also revisiting the avatar and remodeling the face, particularly so that it can appear to be doing really deep listening, and also adding to the movement library so it can do things like move in and really make the user feel seen and heard. And so, the stakes are pretty high with a piece like that, because I don't want to further traumatize the community that I'm serving. And so I'm doing a lot of research over the course of this residency before we release it for trials.
I really appreciate that, because as I was hearing your description of it, it was very clear that this could be a very powerful intervention. And then with power comes responsibility. So a very interesting set of issues, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
So I was going to ask Michelle, as an educator, you mentioned changes in pedagogy necessary for this more human-centered development of AI. With respect to the arts, what kind of computer science, or conversely art, what kind of curricular changes might you propose that can help us work creatively, at this critical intersection of AI and art?
Yeah, thank you. That's actually, Rashaad's inspired me a little bit, actually, because we've been talking a lot about alternative pedagogies within educational institutions to knit together STEM fields and arts, and not just art historians, but also arts practitioners. So what would that look like in a classroom where you usually have a kind of sage on a stage, still traditionally often, and the sort of banking model of education. But what happens if you are trying to move, academic institutions are such medieval structures that as soon as a student gets tracked into a particular major, it's even if it's supposed to be interdisciplinary, and I'm sure all of us can remember all of this, it can be very hard to reach across those domains, especially if you're an undergraduate. And then within the classroom, so this, Rashaad and I have been talking a little bit about it, and I'm also working with Camille Utterback, who's in art and art history. What would it look like to have not lectures, not case studies, but studio engagements with project and design as well? And so you actually you've got arts makers in the same spaces with people from CS and engineering students, that is, trying to think actually about assignments and then actually have that realized in a classroom. I realized once we went down the road that it really upended the traditional ways of teaching. And I know at Stanford, we have the Rob Reich and others have a new embedded curriculum. And I think that's also been incredibly helpful, so that classes like this, I bring race studies and humanities into the mix too. But often classes like that are set aside over in African American studies or race studies or whatever. And the same thing with arts as well. So having, for instance, an embedded ethics class where it's not, it's sort of built in to the education. You're not just people hoping are self-selected who happen to be interested in these issues. And I think that's one of the ways it has to be really integrated into an institution. And I just want to shout out to Carol and Hilary, because I saw your larger piece then too. Your thoughtfulness about the process and making it explicit and extant and awareness, I think is fantastic. And I like the meta dimension of it, and I like that it was sharing to it. And I feel like that is a nice model, an exemplar for people who are trying to do this work going forward. And to speak to James's question, thinking about that then when I get into the classroom and they have models of people who are ethically, virtuously, as they say, engaged in systems that are going to support both artists as well as technologists is wonderful. So, well, thank you for your work too.
I would like to add something to that too. Yeah, I think we have to also think about equitable ways in which we bring outsiders into that conversation, because what I am finding as a practitioner myself is that, we are sort of on the margins engaging in this like deep research and work, often unfunded. And then we're sort of brought into, these big institutions with, this panel is a poignant illustration of, how much that space is a white, cis, hetero space, a male space, right? And so you have these folks doing this research that these folks have often willfully ignored. And then you sort of like, well, come in and like help us make better work, but they're getting paid, exceptionally, where these other people are being brought in and their sort of ideas are being extracted. And then they're sort of like, okay, now you can go back to the margins. And so I think that what that's doing is continuing this extractive, relationship to Black cultural production, Black thought. And so I just think we need to kind of reimagine a way to do that gives both parties optimal well-being.
Rashaad, you've talked also about the whether or not to make your work open access in that larger context of theft of Black cultural production. I think that's really important.
Yeah.
There's actually an audience question exactly on this issue. So I just want to recognize it and continue this part of the discussion because I think it's incredibly important. Hilary mentioned, the audience member says, Hilary mentioned the surprising load of human involvement, and art can be already cost prohibitive, and AI, of course, can be very compute intensive and costly. How do we make sure that the cost barriers to integrating an art and AI don't make it an elite, a privileged activity, and that it's accessible and kind of just in the greater sense of just? And I think Rashaad's comments just were directly on that. One concern could be that even the people who get interested in art and who enter it become not a representative group. So I'd be interested in from each of your perspectives on that risk.
Yeah, I think also I feel like also there's this conversation where like people talk about AI as though it's art. And for me, AI is the product of computer engineering, an interdisciplinary practice of computer engineering, computer science, research. And so that's sort of the product of it. And that can take many different forms. And sometimes that's art and sometimes that's not. But I think for artists that do want to work in that medium, it is quite expensive because it involves so many resources. And I think one way if we're talking about supporting folks who want to do that, is to really look at folks who are not typically seen in those spaces and make those resources, make those funds available to them. And I think this is a great start. I'm really excited to be here and particularly to be with Michelle and be working so closely with someone who really is so aligned with my thought process. But yeah, I think just more of this is what is a nice start.
Follow up to that, Rashaad. Oh, go ahead, Carol. Let's hear it.
Oh, sure. I just wanted to jump in to just add a few things. I think it's a very, very valid point, and I love the question from the audience. We did realize that there was a huge time commitment from the composer, and just the amount of the steep learning curve across all fronts. Even me as a computer science major, it was very challenging to figure out both the music world and the music software that could help me like crop a MIDI file. And then having to learn the AI side too, it was a steep learning curve. And I think that was one of the surprises that we did learn about. And what we would love to do moving forward to facilitate that, Hilary and I have been talking about, like, there's just this need for just even tutorials and putting it on a platform like YouTube where it's accessible to everyone. So you could just be at your home in your bedroom making music. And I do think that that's what we want to encourage is just, people who are passive consumers of content can jump in and become creators and play with these tools. So that's why we really wanted to highlight this database where you didn't have like a cost barrier to download software, where, you can highlight the open source ones, and we could have tutorials to kind of walk people through it from start to finish, so they can generate a whole piece without getting lost with the steep learning curve and not having a community to ask questions.
Hilary, you wanted to follow up there.
Yeah, I wanted to just point out that I'm like that's something that Carol and I have discussed a lot, and I think it does bring access to the technology to people who haven't had all of the hours of training and the help from an AI scientist to navigate the technology. The technology itself is privileged, and so there's also a question there of access to technology, access to like methods of artistic expression. And so it's a very, very deep question and a very, very deep equitable question in society. I wanted to just point out something a little bit like off, I guess a little divergent, but I just want to point out that I am of the opinion as an artist looking at AI being created that people who are coding are artists. Like, coding is artistic, in my opinion. And I think people creating AI are artists. And so we're like separating art and AI in a sense with our words here, but there are many more overlaps than differences between people who are creating and like creating the tools, creating the structures, and the people who are using the tools and the structures to create things. And I would love to hear people's thoughts on that. It's just an impression I have, but I'm just constantly impressed by people who create these really complicated things.
Can I also add, I think to Rashaad, I'm really glad you brought that up. I think you're absolutely right to challenge us and to challenge the status quo across the board. And I think that you're provoking the very question, which is that this can't just be some form of window dressing. I think what you're getting at is that AI's potential is to be very disruptive, and I think that's art's potential. Actually, is that that's what I see them as having in common. That art does the best art force you to re-examine assumptions, and that is a very imperative today. I think that the term you use, narcissistic, perspective is so right on the mark, and I really something that I'm thinking a lot about, and I've been thinking about it in terms of our process at Berkeley, in terms of hiring and admissions. We've been really thinking it through, and making efforts. Again, there's a huge amount to do. And I also want to mention that I'm working on an exhibit for the Catherine Clark Gallery for summer of 2022. And I'd like to follow up with you, Rashaad, because I think that your work is exemplary. And I'd also like to know about new artists, young artists that you know of, that could bring together and really showcase. Because I think that's exactly essential at this stage, is to bring in more voices and really change the status quo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would love to help with that. And yeah, with Hilary, to answer your question, yeah, I guess I feel a bit different from you in that I don't think that AI is just inherently art. I think that, the same way that, like you can use the medium of painting and make a sign that has no artistic value whatsoever, or you can make, so I think that, sort of AI is the result of, a interdisciplinary practice, but what that result is within that sort of container of AI can be a lot of different things. It can be a tool, it can be art, it can be a lot of different things. And so I think the practitioner has to sort of decide that. And then also, then they have to put that out in the world and defend it as such. So yeah, I think it's a little more, it's a little, and I think there's people who go into that practice with no intention of making art at all. And so to say that they're making art is sort of, a little presumptuous maybe. Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question kind of about these collaborations between artists and AI and where the creativity is coming from. So for example, Rashaad, you mentioned so interesting films about AI and robotics, Terminator, Deus Ex Machina, Blade Runner, etc. Many of these films were ahead of the advances of AI that they portrayed. The real classic example being 2001: A Space Odyssey, 20 or 30 years in advance, being way too far ahead on its predictions of AI, but way behind on its predictions for, let's say, computer graphics. So I think to some extent, it just, growing up in that culture as a computer scientist, that these films continually inspire the young scientists and engineers that are working in these areas to be more creative. I'm curious, are there examples of films or other art forms where you really feel like they got into a consultation with AI technologists to help push the artist's creativity well past, our current technical capacity and think about this future? And maybe how have you done this in some of your work? We obviously see one pairing here today with Hilary and Carol working together across that. I'm kind of curious of other experiences.
I don't know if it was directed to Rashaad, but I just wanted to say something really quickly because I'm, in this art and AI class, I'm teaching some films. I was looking at Steven Spielberg's Just AI, which was the measure of AI machine is if it can love and be loved. And I think it's interesting when you go back to when you're talking about 2001 Odyssey. When I looked at it again, I was kind of horrified because one of the things, I don't feel like it was ahead of its time. It figures that the first time that, someone has a tool, they slaughter somebody else, and there's certain embedded notions about human advancement and achievement that get carried forward. Because as you said, and Kevin Scott and others have pointed out that there are these certain moments that then inform technologists and artists sort of going forward. But I think the thing I really liked about so many artists' work, including Rashaad's, but also Amelia Winger-Bearskin, who I was mentioning, is she's offering other models and other cosmologies and not just assuming the usual Western scripts. Often they're biblical plots or some notion of evolution that has never been challenged, but keeps animating some of the product design and priorities that show up as well. So I think it's really important to question some of those earlier cultural works that continue to kind of, they have assumptions about not just humans, but more specifically people of color, gendered folks. And I think that and the gendering that goes on in them. And I think that's worth challenging too, because they're so deep and unconscious that I don't think people even pay attention to them necessarily. And I think the artists, especially if they're coming from different backgrounds and worldviews, actually can put some pressure on that.
Thanks, Michelle. I think that's a great comment to kind of end our time. We're at the end here. So thank you all for your insights into this developing space. We're going to take a quick break and then return for the day's final session focused on education. So we'll see everyone back here in 15 minutes at 1 p.m. Thank you, all of our panelists.
Thank you. Fantastic.